Good morning. Good morning. I'd just like to thank Mr. Walton for inviting me to the conference. My name is Joe Butler, and between 2003 and 2008 I researched and wrote a doctoral thesis under the supervision of Dr. Jamie Sarnes and Dr. Seamus O'Sheacon in the University of Ireland. I defended the thesis successfully and was awarded a doctorate in 2009, and then haven't really done much about Burton at all. Took a little bit of a break, a long break, unintentionally perhaps. The title of the thesis was Sex, Race and Fieldwork, Locating a Figure in the History of Anthropology, Richard Francis Burton, 1821 to 1890. I'm going to skip the usual intro to who Burton was, because you all know. My own first encounter with Burton was through the film Mountains of the Moon, which dealt with Burton's career as an explorer in East Africa and his search for the source of the Nile. The film interested me enough to buy a copy of the biography of Burton by Byron Farewell, and it was in a Hodges Fidges bookshop in Dublin, and it had the Leighton portrait facing out in Burton, so I couldn't miss it, and I got it. And I read it, and this may have been the first time that I ever heard the term anthropology itself, because Farewell identifies him clearly as an anthropologist. It's logical to him all the way through. For me then, and indeed now, anthropology and Burton were inextricably linked. In my first week as an undergraduate anthropology student in Maynooth, I was surprised when I went to the library and found no mention of Burton in the various histories of anthropology. The greatest surprise was, perhaps, when I did find him in George Stocking's book, Victorian Anthropology. Burton is dismissed in less than half a page by Stocking as a crank whose anthropological work had no merit at all. And he was attacking the Anthropological Society of London. At the time, I closed the book and forgot about Burton and got on working with the proper anthropological material that we were being lectured on, so Malinowski, Evans Richard, Anna Singh, James Clifford, writing culture, all of that. And then I went back years later, I come to the PhD, and I never forgot this. Burton was a forgotten anthropologist. Though it became clear as I read into the topic that Burton does appear in the history of anthropology, even if it has a shadowy figure in the background. Apart from Victorian anthropology, he occurs as a brief mention or a footnote in a small number of essays and books on the history of the discipline. Burton's life and work as an anthropologist were never really examined in detail. Throughout his life, Burton had an interest in the native peoples he encountered on his travels. He was constantly observing and noting everything that he saw. It was one of his chief interests and was often pursued to the detriment of his official professions of soldier, explorer and consul. So the pilgrimage to Mecca was just to avoid having to go back to his regiment. He found out the Royal Geographical Society had a fund to explore Arabia, not even to go to Mecca. And he applied for it and canvassed for it just to avoid having to go back to the army. Many of his published works could, at least in part, or a pilgrimage in full, be classified as works of ethnography. He published numerous letters, articles and monographs on anthropological themes. He was innovative in his fieldwork methodology and in the topics he chose for study, particularly human sexuality. He was a personal acquaintance of many of the leading anthropological figures of the day, such as James Hunt, Pitt Rivers and E.B. Tyler. He was a founding member and a vice president of the Anthropological Society of London, which eventually amalgamated with the Ethnological Society of London to become the Anthropological Institute, which survives today as the Royal Anthropological Institute. And if you go there to their office, they have a portrait of Burton, but they don't really have him as a founding father. And of course, famously, they sold his books as well to California, if I remember correctly. Practitioners and historians of anthropology do not include Burton, yet those outside the discipline, such as biographers, historians on a number of subjects, British Empire, exploration, sexuality, erotic and pornography, Victorian studies, the occult, etc., post-colonial scholars, literary critics, novelists and documentary filmmakers frequently do describe Burton as an anthropologist. It seems obvious to him. The thesis was the first time that Burton's life and work as an anthropologist were analysed in detail. The methodology was archived research into official and private material relating to Burton and a critical reading of key Burton texts, anthropological texts and relevant secondary and theoretical works. The chapters line up in chronological order and concern episodes of Burton's life that are dealt with from an anthropological perspective. In British India, of course modern day Pakistan, as a young officer, Burton developed a fieldwork methodology that prefigured the participant observation methodology of the 20th century. And all this earned him was criticism for transgressing British cultural boundaries, cultivating irregular habits, as one early book reviewer put it. Burton's use of disguise in his pilgrimage to Mecca was designed to deceive both the British audience and the Muslim society, and it is examined in the thesis as a unique peak of ethnographic research. And quite a lot, he had a lot of support from local Arab people and Muslim people, and they advised him at various stages to change the disguise. So when he made the switch to disguise, that was on the advice of some of his Arab friends. And of course this thing of being an outsider, so he explained strange behaviour. Also he posed as a healer, which gave him contact with women. So it's one of the few examples in early anthropology where a male anthropologist can actually get data about women, because women would go to him with problems, and of course he was observing and he learned a lot about them. In the next chapter, of course, on Somaliland, I attempted to create a Rashomon style of analysis, trying to be really clever, examining the failure of the Somaliland expedition from a number of viewpoints. And my supervisor just said it was totally confusing. I didn't. In Somaliland, it might be better. I tried anyway, but it was interesting, the different viewpoints. In Somaliland, the combination of political naivety and cultural arrogance led Burton to ignore the ethnographic evidence he was collecting and to underestimate the determination of the Somali tribes to resist British intrusion into their lands. They suspected correctly that the British intended to end the slave trade, and they weren't having it. Especially after Burton dismissed a Somali guide, the Aban, and refused to hire another. Somali warriors attacked the expedition and sacked their camp. Burton's marginality in his own society was then reflected by the fact that the East India Company officials at Aden eventually found Burton to be responsible for the attack. So Burton went back to England, went to Crimea, he was preparing for the East African. He always assumed that sooner or later he'd get compensation and he'd be exonerated. And Brigadier Coughlin and Playfair and Rigby, they started investigating, and there was some of Burton's own fault. They didn't take enough security precautions. And I was reading the file. Mary Lovell talks about the file in her biography, that she didn't get a chance to really go into it, the file of the Somali expedition. And the letters are going back and forth, and it's convenient for Coughlin to find Burton responsible. And then, and you're waiting for this, they're really going to take the side of Somali warriors over a British expedition where a British officer was murdered, and eventually someone in London went, hold on there, stop. But Burton didn't really get compensation, and he was held responsible for the failure of the expedition. Burton's search for the source of the Nile demonstrated the scientific standards set in Britain for fieldwork were conditional upon social status and political expediency as much as anything else. The reality of the conditions that these expeditions travelled in meant that the explorers were quite literally out of their minds for much of the time. The effects of the fevers and illnesses and the drugs the explorers self-medicated with were hardly conducive to empirical accuracy. So there's Johannes Fabian, I think the Dutch anthropologist, has a great book called Out of Their Minds. He said, they're drinking brandy and all that, and yet they're the empirical, the monarch of all this survey. In West Africa, Burton, in his new capacity as consul, very reluctant consul, conducted some of his strongest fieldwork, but his conclusions were largely predetermined by hardening racial attitudes in Britain. Burton played a part in the Western intellectual oppression of the mid to late 19th century of Africa. However, his racially prejudiced writings inspired resistance by two remarkable African men, the lawyer William Rainey and the British Army doctor James Africanus Horton. And Horton wrote, he has a biography by Christopher Fyfe, but he wrote in his own monograph, very brilliant, defunct, like he attacked Burton and said Burton contradicts himself. 1 minute you're racist, the next minute you're actually appreciating the Africans. You contradict your own racism. And he contradicted Hunt, who wrote The Negro's Place in Nature, a vile piece of racism. Even then it was controversial. It was also during this period in West Africa, here comes the contradiction, Burton wrote one of his strongest pieces of ethnography, A Mission to Galel, King of Dahomey. And when Melville Hershkovitz researched and wrote his ethnography of Dahomey in the 1930s, he made extensive use of Burton's book. The first volume in particular is just full of endnotes and footnotes to Burton's book, which was an ethnography. And the diplomatic mission from the very beginning was a failure, and then Burton did participant observation. He just spent the months he was there just noting absolutely everything. And that was the second book that Isabel Burton republished. So everyone considered it a considerable piece of work. The anthropological society that Burton helped form was organisationally innovative and theoretically unsound in equal measure. It ultimately failed, but the racial theories it espoused would become fashionable in the latter decades of the century. Whatever vision Burton had for this society, which he once referred to as a new religion, his long absences from London meant that his influence on the society was minimal. Near the end of his life, Burton's lifelong study of sexuality became a means of resistance against conservative forces campaigning for social control in Victorian Britain. It also brought him in some money. A century before Foucault's History of Sexuality, Burton understood perfectly the reality of the official, respectable Victorian attitudes to human sexuality. So why are they going on about it so much if they're so against it? And of course it's prurience. And the 10 volumes came out, and then of course it was criticised for the more. And then of course before the sixth volume, Supplemental Nights, come out, he has an essay called, I think, the reviewer on these books, and he lets them have it. And about 60 pages, he just goes for it. And this is 100 years before Foucault's History of Sexuality. In his book, Lawrence of Arabia, Films Anthropology, Lawrence Caton writes that the figure of Lawrence was an anthropological figure, a liminal figure, a person who straddles different societies. Caton believes that Lawrence shared a characteristic that is typical of many anthropologists, and Claude Levi-Strauss agrees as well, that of not fitting into their own society. This explains why some people choose to become anthropologists so they can escape their own society by living in and studying other societies. Burton also puts the anthropological figure that Caton had in mind with Lawrence. He seemed to be constantly seeking out opportunities to flee his own society. A perennial outsider, he was always critical of British society. Throughout his life, Burton was a marginal figure in his own society, and as one anonymous reviewer pointed out, he had a tendency for making enemies among his own countrymen. So Isabel Burton was passionately defending him, and then this was after he died, and a reviewer of one of the books wrote in the Edinburgh Review, okay, hold on there a minute, let's look at Burton's career. And again, this feeds into what the previous speaker said about the Sufism thing, but he constantly upset people, and also he made mistakes. And the Somali expedition was his fault. He wasn't a very good expedition commander. And then, so he can't really complain when they reject him and don't let him advance. The sense of difference and isolation probably came from within Burton himself. His interest in cultures other than his own was probably stimulated by his discomfort with his own culture, arguable perhaps. For their part, one of the key causes of the distrust that Burton found among his peers was his interest and participation in native cultures. The qualities that made him an anthropologist, the language skills and the desire to conduct ethnographic research among the native peoples, were for him initially a means of furthering his career. These activities probably damaged his career. People suspected him of going native. Peculiar attainments was another one. He was eminently qualified with peculiar attainments. The thesis examined Burton's life and work as an anthropologist. Burton's anthropological toolkit, language skills, powers of observation, participation, his fieldwork in uncolonised regions, his dislike of hypocrisy and his unembarrassed mind make him perhaps attractive to modern anthropology. These aspects and a lack of personal wealth and social connection made him controversial during his own era. During the 19th century, support for British imperialism by right of military conquest, a belief in the cultural superiority of the British man and the belief in the inferiority of other races was perfectly respectable. Now, of course, it's beyond the pale of decent opinion. In short, while Burton's Stocking's Victorian Anthropology is a key text on the subject, I think I've proved that Burton's life and work as an anthropologist, whether you praise or condemn him, warrants more than a one-page dismissal or a mere footnote. To conclude, there's a quote from Gillian Beer, who writes, "To dismiss all Victorian writers as racist because they use vocabulary that offends us now, or because they all work within a developmental view of history, has a further powerful disadvantage. It has the effect of absolving present-day readers and allowing us to feel enlightened. The rejection costs us no self-inquiry." And as Clifford Geertz, the late Clifford Geertz, put it, let he who writes free of his time's imaginings cast the first stone. Thank you.